I have the pleasure to introduce Stevie Hayes. Steve was here in 2014 giving a talk at Agile Warsaw. I remember this evening is very full of very inspiring stories of teams and their problems. So I'd like to hear more.
All right, so
please welcome Steve.
Let's go. Okay, so thank you. The very first thing I want to say is thank you to the organisers. I used to speak at conferences a lot in Australia, and then I spent 6 years in investment banking where I didn't get to speak anywhere at all. So this is the first time I've spoken at a conference for quite a while, and I'm thankful for the opportunity. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about things I've learned in 15 years of being an Agile coach. And I will speak in generalisations, but I understand that this is Agile by example. So I'm going to back up those generalisations with specific stories from my past. So hopefully that will keep everybody happy. And the first example I'm going to use is me, because who doesn't like talking about themselves, right? So, my background, I have a degree in mathematics, which means I have a bias towards numbers. I really like quantitative things. Sometimes that's a strength, sometimes that's a weakness. I am extremely introverted. My wife says that I am the only person she has ever met who is more introverted than herself, which gives you some idea of why we're married and that we don't have a fantastic social life. I'm still a programmer at heart, although I deal with people a lot these days. I'll also mention that in my heart, I still think that I'm in my 30s, so you shouldn't rely on my heart too much. And socially, I tend to what some people would call the dragnet style of interaction. If anybody has seen that movie, the catchphrase is, "Just the facts, ma'am." I just want the facts, and when I write emails, I frequently I write the body and then realise that real people put social interactions at the beginning and the end, and I have to go back and fill those in before I send it. Which is all to say that things don't come naturally to me, and everything that I know about people I have learned over time. So lesson number 1 is anybody can learn to be an Agile coach. It doesn't matter what your current role is. It doesn't matter what your skills are. It doesn't matter if you're an introvert or an extrovert. You can grow to be a successful coach. So I encourage everybody to take up that role, whether it's for whole teams, for organizations, or whether it's for some other individual within your group. View yourself as coaching other people all the time. Okay. Lesson number 2 for today. Your career is a combination of reputation and serendipity. The first you can control, the second you can't. So reputation, I view my job as a coach as making myself redundant. I go into an organisation with the aim of improving the skills of the individuals, improving the skills of the team, so that they're able to take over, and I can either end up drinking Mai Tais on a beach in the South Pacific somewhere, or I can move on to another gig. Now, if that's your view of being a coach, then you face the challenge of having a continual set of engagements rather than one lifelong set of single employment. So you have to be visible. You have to be visible to the people who might give you work. And you have to find your drink. Excuse me. Okay. So visibility, you need to speak. You need to speak at conferences, you need to speak at user groups, you need to speak inside your organisation. Sometimes you need to speak in front of the mirror. All of those things are important. You need to blog. You need to be saying things. They don't all have to be world-changing things, but you have to be out there in whatever you think of as your community. That may be the world. That may be a company. It may be Warsaw. It may be Poland. It may be Europe. It doesn't matter how you define your community, but you have to be visible in it. Once you're visible in it, you will start to build reputation. So let me give you a couple of examples of the combination of reputation and serendipity. One is when I went back to Australia. I've been doing Agile for a long time. I moved back from New York to Australia in 2001. And when I did that, no one in Australia was doing extreme programming, which was my flavour of Agile at the time. So my goal was to create enough work for me to get a job. That was it. I had a very limited goal. So I travelled the country, which thankfully for Australia mostly means travelling up and down the east coast, flying between Melbourne and Brisbane and Sydney, talking at user groups, technical user groups if they would have me in any language, talking at business groups if they would let me speak, talking in companies, talking at universities, anywhere I could go. And in the end, I did build up a reasonable amount of visibility. And some of those things turned into work. But the interesting things for me were that I could never predict what contacts would turn into work. So there were things that I thought would turn into immediate jobs that never turned into anything at all. And there were other contacts that turned into work to my complete surprise, so serendipity. And if you're in this market, I don't know what it's like now, but in those days, my average lead time from a contact to work was about 2 years. I would get a piece of engagement and I would trace the contact back to a conference 2 years earlier. So maybe I'll be getting a gig in Warsaw sometime in 2018. Who knows? So it's that level of unpredictability. And the last is how I ended up here. I spoke in 2014, was it, at the Agile user group, because at the time I was working for Goldman Sachs and Goldman wanted to increase their visibility in Warsaw in order to hire people. So I had no other ambition other than speaking on behalf of my employer. But 2 years later, here I am speaking at a conference. So reputation and serendipity. Lesson number 3. When you go into any gig, you have a limited amount of influence. Whether that influence is measured in time, money, attention, patience, tolerance, your tolerance for the teams, their tolerance for you, doesn't really matter, but your resources are finite. And I feel like, in some sense, I'm echoing the keynote from this morning talking about bounded leadership. So what I'm going to do is present 2 different models of actively allocating your influence in a particular context. The first one is from a guy called Stephen Covey, who already recognises this. Okay, that's pretty good. When I speak in London, I get almost no one. I think here we got maybe 10%. So for everyone else, Covey, this is from a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I strongly encourage you to go and read that book. I try to reread it every few years because it's the sort of stuff that you understand intellectually, but you need to habitualize, as the title implies. So Covey talks about 2 different circles. One is your circle of concern, the things that you are worried about, interested in, things that you think you would like to have different, the things that sort of just go through your mind from over and over. And the inner circle is the circle of things you can actually change. And there's a gap between those 2 things. So my life is an Australian living in London with an American wife and a dual citizen child. And my next 20 years of my life are governed by the unpredictable acts of 3 Western democracies. So given the political systems in Australia, England and America, at any point in time there is something that is just irritating the heck out of me. And I would usually use stronger language at home. But I can't influence those things, only to a very limited extent. My wife can vote in the United States, I can vote in the UK, neither of us can vote in Australia, where we can advocate with our friends on positions, but our influence is very, very small, even though they're in my circle of concern. And Covey would say that stress comes from the gap between those 2 circles, and certainly that is reflected in my own life. So what do you do about that? Well, there's a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy. The short-term strategy is shrink your circle of concern. Learn consciously how to ignore things. It seems a little odd to say consciously ignore things, but it's quite important. So a story to back this up. I've worked a lot, when I worked in banks, I worked a lot with architects. And architects in particular seem to be really, really comfortable producing long lists of things that are broken from their perspective. I mean, it's nice to be a visionary and an idealist, but they crank out hundreds of things that are broken that need fixing. So I've got one particular guy in mind who I had a mentoring relationship with, and at our first meeting, that's what he did. And I said to him, look, the hard thing here is not producing this list. The hard thing here is figuring out which one or two things you are going to change. He said, yeah, okay, I get it. So we had our next meeting and he came back with a list of 100 things that needed to be changed. I said, no, you're just not getting this. You need to focus. And after multiple loops of the same sort of process, in the end, he was ejected from the organization because his inability to reduce his circle of concern and just ignore stuff left him so diffuse, so unfocused that he actually achieved nothing at all. So I think it's really important as a first step to reduce your circle of concern. How do you, in the longer term, the strategy is increase your circle of influence. How do you do that? There are lots and lots of ways to increase your circle of influence. The easiest to imagine and the most well-known is building relationships with individuals. Covey has stuff to talk about that. Many other people do, and I suspect other people at the conference will talk about building relationships. So I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to talk about transparency, trust, and the impact they have on influence. So once upon a time, I worked at a travel company called Lonely Planet, which was very well known at the time, but less well known now. And they were trying to set up a digital platform for the third time. Their first two attempts had been a failure, which had spent lots of money and produced nothing. What had happened in the organisation was someone had a very sudden medical diagnosis that meant they had to leave the organisation for a while. Lots of people shuffled around, and the role that was left open was the head of development for this digitisation project, which had about 100 people in a warehouse roughly the size of this space, but flat, and lots of things on walls, and everybody building in an agile way. The first thing I learned when I arrived was that the project was doomed. The technical people knew that, but nobody had found a way to tell management. So my very first job was to tell managers that they were going to leave an $8 million crater in the ground, but nothing else. So you can imagine the impact of this was to break the trust between the development team and the management team almost immediately. So the first thing we had to do was rebuild that. And we did two concrete things that will serve as the basis of this example. The first one was technical. We put build lights all over the place so that every time the build broke, we got red lights. Everybody in the program could see what was going on and we could focus on rebuilding that and getting stability. But more importantly, we worked on transparency between the technical people and the management team. Every day, the team leaders would send me an email that was a summary of what they'd been doing. I would collate, condense, occasionally edit a bit, and I would forward it to the CTO and the rest of the senior management team so that every day they understood what was going on in the development teams. Some days were good, some days were bad, but we knew the goals and we knew the gaps we were trying to close. And eventually, we restored the faith between the two parts of the organisation through fairly violent transparency. And in the end, I had more influence in that project than I had anywhere else I've ever been. So I think this was a critical step towards shaping that entire project, and we did deliver. And Lonely Planet did get its digital platform, and then a few weeks later, the SARS virus crippled travel all around the world. Excellent timing. So I started to talk about two models of actively allocating influence. This is the second one. And I'm not a big fan of quadrant analyses. I think of them as sort of cheap managerial consulting tools, but hey, here's one that I've put together. In any situation, I look at what I could do and I throw it into one of these four quadrants fairly quickly. Some things are easy to change but have low impact. Some things are hard to change but have high impact. That's the diagonal. The things that are high cost of change and low impact I forget about. The things that are low cost of change and high impact we do straight away. And then we have to figure out what to do about the diagonal. And there's two strategies there. If it's low cost but low impact, then try to figure out how to raise the impact. And if it's high cost but high impact, try to figure out how to reduce the cost. Okay. But sometimes things surprise you. So I've got another example for you from this kind of model. And I was working at a bank in New York, and we were pair programming. And pair programming is an interesting technique because aside from the technical merits, it surfaces conflict in the team better than anything else I've ever tried. Some people will say it creates conflict. I don't think that that's true most of the time. But if there is existing potential for conflict, pair programming will surface that fairly quickly. So we had mechanisms to deal with conflict in the pairs, and one of them was to escalate to the coach/team leader, which was me. And one afternoon, two people came along, and since they're both still working in that organisation, I'll use substitute names. So Bob and Carol came around to talk to me about this particular problem. And after listening to the two sides, I reasonably quickly came down on the side of Bob and said, okay, I think this is the way we should go forwards. Not a big deal. Carol, here's why I think we should do this. Are you okay with that? And the short answer was, hell no, I'm not okay with that. And what I thought was a reasonably straightforward conversation rapidly escalated. And in the end, I walked away and said, okay, it's fine, we'll go Carol's way. Thanks very much, and headed off. And a couple of hours later, Bob came round to me utterly confused and said, but I was right, you agreed, but we went with her way. Why did that happen? I said, it's really easy to explain. I thought it was a low-cost, low-impact area, and I wasn't really fussed about it until I realised that it was a low-impact, high-cost area. The cost was going to be that I was going to burn my relationship with Carol in order to make some stupid decision about SQL and Java that really didn't have a big impact on the project, and I simply wasn't going to do that. And Bob had never looked at it from that perspective, and he said that was a really useful tool, which is why I share it with you. And he went on to become a managing director at Goldman Sachs. So I'm reasonably pleased that I had some hand in shaping his career. The other thing you can do to move things around these quadrants is to do constrained experiments. People who are familiar with Dave Snowden's Cynefin model will know that Dave talks a lot in the complex domain about using safe-to-fail experiments. This is another slightly different use of a very similar approach. If you ask people to make a decision and they think that the impact is for the rest of the project or the rest of their career, they become pretty invested in that decision and want lots of evidence. But if you can reduce it to a smaller impact in time or in space, then you can get a lot more collaboration. And it's much easier to do something that people think is reversible later. So if I go into an organisation, right now I'm working with an asset management company in London. We're trying to introduce agile change. I shudder at using the words. They already are using Scrum. We just need to improve their usage of Scrum. There's about 100 people in that organisation. But rather than try to change everything across the board, I am working with one or two smaller teams. I'm sounding out what's going on in the rest of the organisation, but I'm focusing on getting success stories in two teams that I can use as reference cases for the rest of the organisation. Because if I can demonstrate success in their context, then they're much more willing to listen to me, and I've moved things that were high cost potentially over to low cost for the same impact. So this is a way to move things around. Within a given team, I'll start with a single practice. So one of those teams, our only goal is to help them figure out how to break stories down into smaller pieces so that they can manage their iterations better. There are lots of other things we could change. We're leaving those outside. We're not concerned about those at all. We're focusing on influencing the way they break down stories. So lesson number 4 is actually a summary of the things that I just talked about then. Although you walk into an organisation or a team with a finite amount of influence to spend, you can change that total budget over time. You can grow it, you can shrink it. I could have shrunk it by burning my relationship with Carol. I can grow it by demonstrating success. Dave Thomas, Badara Dave Thomas says, shut up and ship. Or alternatively, those who ship get to speak. And what he's really saying is, if you can demonstrate a record of success, then you're more influential. Lesson number 5. This happened, this question was asked of me over lunch about 20 years ago, much to my surprise. Would you rather be right or would you rather get things done? I'd never considered those two things to be alternatives before. I thought the way that you got things done was to be right. It turned out that that wasn't the case. And I must admit that if you ask me, do I enjoy being right? The answer is, oh yes, very, very much. I love being right. And if you really want to wrong foot me and get me agitated, just ask me 3 or 4 questions in a row that force me to say, I don't know. Because by the 4th one, I just want to run away from you and hide. So this was a bit challenging. And the answer is, well, actually, I'd rather get things done. So here's a story. Well, let me back up one step first. I actually see these 2 schools of thought in both coaches and technical architects. There are technical architects who go into an engagement saying, I have the solution, now all I need to do is get the team to build it. And they view the team as the execution engine for their vision. You have coaches who go into organisations or teams and say, I already know how to solve this. It's to use Scrum or to use extreme programming or whatever practices du jour you want to use. And their goal is to enlighten the team and move the team from where they are to the coach's vision of the truth. I don't think that's an effective strategy. So once upon a time, I was the development manager at a company, and we were having a company-wide technical retrospective, and the developers reached a conclusion on how they wanted to approach a particular problem, which I thought was insanity. I don't actually remember what the issue was well. I think it was something to do about how we did design reviews in the flow of a sprint, but I thought their way was doomed to failure. And after lengthy discussion, they failed to convince me, so we were a little bit of an impasse. So I had 2 choices. One was to say, the easy one, you can't do this, we're going to do it my way. The other, which is what we did, was to say, I still don't agree with you, and I feel safe to express that, but it's your project, and you need to do it the way you think you should do it, but let's turn it into a safe-to-fail experiment. Let's do it your way for 2 weeks. And then we'll see how it goes. Now, in my arrogance and confidence, I was absolutely certain that in 2 weeks we would have demonstrated that I was right and they were wrong, because I love to be right. Unfortunately, in 2 weeks we demonstrated that they were right and I was wrong, and we went with their solution. And that was a much more powerful outcome than me enforcing something that was right. I would say you do need to enforce what you think is right if something fatal will happen, in the sense of the project will die or somebody on the team will damage their career. But other than that, you should let the team go. And I want to give one more example, which is a little bit more extreme even than that. The Agile Manifesto says people over process, and I believe that. But in 1999, when I joined Goldman Sachs, I walked in with a PDF of a book that had yet to be published called Extreme Programming Explained, which I had just finished reviewing. And I said, if you hire me, this is what I will do. And to my eternal gratitude, they simply said, okay, that's fine, off you go. So in 1999, I started cranking on this team to implement XP. Within 12 months, everybody on my team had left, which is a success in one way, I suppose. We had implemented extreme programming, but only by hiring a completely new team of people who knew they were going to do XP when they were hired. The rest of the team, one person went to Harvard to do their MBA, the rest took internal mobility. And they continued to tell me that it had nothing to do with me or extreme programming, and I continued to not believe them. I had done the ultimate process over people. I had done it with an agile process, but nevertheless, I had assumed that my agile process was more important than the team, and I'd managed to burn a whole team. I don't want to do that again. Lesson number 6, conflict is normal. Don't try to avoid it, normalise it. For those of you who follow organisational theory, this is one of the things I think holacracy gets right. They normalise practices for resolving conflict. And I just want to share 2 examples of practices I've learned to do this. One I learned from a group called Role Model Software in North Carolina, which was simply to evaluate how we feel, the intensity of our feeling about a position in a scale of 1 to 3, where 1 is, if we don't do this my way, I'm walking away, and 3 is, I have an opinion, but whatever. Okay. So if you both do that, if you both come up 3s, you might as well just toss a coin and pick one of the outcomes. If one of you is a 1 and one of you is a 3, go with however the person with intensity 1 feels about the outcome. If both of you feel that it's a 1, then you better get up, walk away, and have a very careful, considered conversation. The second technique is something I learned at Goldman Sachs. So after the, whatever names I used, Bob and Carol, after the Bob and Carol debacle, we said, okay, we have to change the practices, change the way we approach this, because I had a queue of pairs who were escalating their problems to me, and I wasn't enjoying that very much at all. So we changed the process to be, sure, pairs should still be able to escalate conflicts, but if you do, you have to pull the cord, do the stop the line thing, and get everybody on the team together and discuss with the whole team position A, position B, and why you as a pair are unable to resolve that conflict. Which might be quite reasonable. It might be something that impacts the entire team, and that's important. But I can tell you that once we changed that practice, the number of escalation incidents declined dramatically, and people put a lot more effort into resolving conflicts themselves. The last lesson. Technology changes fast, but humanity is a constant. So I started doing XP in 1999. I was using Java 1.2. Our continuous integration tool was a DOS batch script that just looped indefinitely. We were doing acceptance tests by directly comparing HTML text after we stripped out dates. We were not doing anything particularly sophisticated. And I wouldn't carry any of that forwards to today, not as it was at the time. But almost all the examples excuse me, that I drew on for this session are at 10 years old or more. There are a couple from the last year or two, but most of them are over a decade old, and some of them actually 15 years old. So while I think investing in your understanding of technology is really useful because I think it helps you build reputation and influence, I think it's an underpinning for your ability to work with teams, or if not programming skills and technical skills, at least some specialization, I think, is good foundation. It's the things that I've learned about people over the last 15 years that have given me the best return on investment over the entire period. And that's it. I am here for the rest of the conference. I am doing a Meet the Experts session tomorrow. If you want to sign up for that, I'm happy to take questions over any break. Come and interrupt me. Remember that I'm very introverted, so you have to approach me first. Thank you very much.